So in this paper, Hila and me compare the dynamics and impact created by two developments that seek to address modern slavery in GVCs. One is the emergence in recent years of corporate anti-trafficking legislation, abbreviated CAT, such as transparency and due diligence legislation, and the other is the deployment of the worker-driven social responsibility, the Wsr model. Specifically, we compare two types of what we term anti-trafficking chains. That is the provision of anti-trafficking services by non- and for-profit entities to multinational corporations through what structurally resembles supply chains. In recent years, there is a growing recognition among scholars and policymakers that the traditional anti-trafficking tools, such as criminalization of traffickers, strict border controls, and ex-post human rights assistance to identified victims, fall short to effectively deal with severe forms of labor exploitation. Hence, scholars and activists call for the adoption of new anti-trafficking structural paradigms, such as the labor and development approaches, that rest on the understanding that human trafficking is enabled and sustained by the intrinsic governance gaps of GVCs, being a major source of today's corporate revenues. The call to address root causes and place responsibility with those who profit from labor exploitation is reflected in the emergence of corporate social responsibility anti-trafficking tools. I will call them AT tools, built on the understanding that if human trafficking is generated and sustained by the structural conditions under which supply chains operate, then it must be tackled by addressing the governance of supply chains. Roughly speaking, the CSR AT tools include three types: corporate self-regulatory initiatives, corporate anti-trafficking legislation, and worker social responsibility-driven schemes. The latter two present alternative approaches to the identified failures of CSR. Corporate anti-trafficking legislation was adopted in recent years by several countries, including the UK, the Netherlands, France, Australia, and the state of California in the US, all aiming at increasing transparency in supply chain management and exposing corporations to public and consumer pressures. For the purposes of this presentation, and despite significant differences, thank you, Ioannis, we include under CAT legislation both transparency and due diligence laws. The Wsr model was originated from grassroots organization of workers and involved suppliers and lead firms. So far, it was implemented by the Fair Food Program, FFP, in the tomato fields of Florida in the US, and the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in the Bangladeshi government sector, and the Milk with Dignity program in the dairy sector in Vermont. The notion of AT chains, anti-trafficking chains, refers to the web of AT initiatives in GVCs, which is comprised of civil society and for-profit organizations, professional bodies, and multi-level and cross-sectoral initiatives that opt to provide the corporate world with AT services and solutions, anti-trafficking. By using this notion, we seek to capture the dynamics and power relations created within this web of AT efforts in GVCs and between AT initiatives and lead firms. We suggest that the extent to which anti-trafficking efforts are independent from the supply chain dynamic is crucial for their effectiveness as governance mechanisms. Critical GVC scholars suggest that the governance of GVCs has increasingly become a contested terrain over which corporate, state, and national and international civil society actors vie to shape and control. Drawing on this understanding, we argue that in recent decades, the struggle over the governance of GVC transformed in a pendulum-like movement, while the global widespread of private CSR governance mechanism marks a movement of decentering the state. The emergence of CAT legislation in recent years heralds a counter movement of recentering the state. However, as corporate actors have successfully managed to restrain both movements, their impact on workers' welfare and working conditions at the lowest tiers of GVCs has proved to be far too limited. We therefore ask how the structural and dynamic setting under which AT chains operate within GVCs affect their outcomes, and under which conditions anti-trafficking chains may transform corporate behavior and serve as effective drivers of change in combating human trafficking in GVCs. To address these questions, we analyzed qualitative data from our research on the response of the UK construction sector to the MSA, to the Modern Slavery Act, in the UK, and critically reviewed and analyzed research studies on WSR, on the worker-driven scheme. I don't know what happened. Is it okay?
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay, sorry. Aimed at exposing corporations that allow severe exploitation in their supply chain to public and consumer pressures by means of transparency requirements, the UK Modern Slavery Act
Tamar?
by adopting.
Tamar, you got stuck a little bit, so I think Tamar just left us. Here she's back. Tamar?
מה קרה?
We couldn't hear you more or less since you started the Modern Slavery Act.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, and now we can also see the screen.
Okay. Don't deduct the time. Aimed at exposing corporations that allow severe exploitation in their supply chain to public and consumer pressures by means of transparency requirements, the UK Modern Slavery Act was the first piece of legislation in Europe that addressed human trafficking in supply chains. Specifically, Section 54 of the Act requires any organization that conducts business in the UK within a certain annual net turnover to publish each year a slavery and human trafficking statements approved by the organization's board of directors and signed by a director. The Act does not mandate specific actions firms must take to eradicate human trafficking, nor does it provide any public monitoring mechanisms or sanctions for non-compliance. It should be noted, though, that following a public consultation process in last July, the UK government introduced an amended bill that seeks to strengthen the provision of Section 54. This bill is still under the consideration of the House of Lords and therefore beyond the scope of this presentation. The enactment of the Modern Slavery Act in 2015 has led to a surge of anti-trafficking efforts in supply chains, which in turn gave rise to an industry of legal services and professional guidance. The construction industry is globally recognized as one of these sectors most prone to severe labor exploitation. There are no exact figures of trafficking and forced labor victims in this sector, but it is widely agreed that several sector-specific factors put construction workers at a very high risk of exploitation and abuse. Hence, after 2015, anti-trafficking initiatives offering main contractors a range of services to assist them in complying with the Act have increased. The diagram illustrates our suggestion that this AT activity has been adapted to the typical structure of the sector's supply chain and to its response to the requirement of the Act. That is, much like labor subcontractors and materials and professional suppliers, AT initiatives were forced to adapt their services to lead firms' needs. However, despite the increase in AT activities in GVCs, there is no clear evidence that the Modern Slavery Act has a significant impact on the ground. We argue that the gap between the booming AT activity and its actual impact on the ground is a result of the Act's reliance on market compliant mechanisms and the inherent imbalanced power relations between anti-trafficking actors and corporations. Under these circumstances, anti-trafficking actors are forced into a supply chain dynamic which significantly limits the leverage over corporate behavior. Such dynamic particularly affects anti-trafficking activities in the construction sector, as it is far less affected by consumer demands and pressures compared to other sectors such as retail and consumer goods. Indeed, as indicated by the fact that construction companies have centered on the minimal reporting requirements, their compliance with the Act was driven by the potential regulatory risk it poses rather than a reputational risk. Consequently, anti-trafficking initiatives are forced into a weak position vis-a-vis lead firms with little to no capacities to transform corporate behavior. Put differently, the dependency of anti-trafficking efforts on corporate funding strengthens the supply chain dynamics rather than distorts it. In sum, despite the explicit intention that consumers, investors, and NGOs will take the role of monitoring compliance, the Modern Slavery Act has not yet given rise to such a market-oriented compliance mechanism, nor to an institutional environment with the leverage to inspire significant change in corporate behavior. We therefore suggest that the Modern Slavery Act not only has not hardened the softened edges of beyond compliance and self-regulatory tools, but it might have in fact weakened them. To you, Hila.
So we now want to turn to talk about worker-driven social responsibility and the anti-trafficking chain it creates. So Tamar, if you can pass to the next slide. So the worker-driven social responsibility WSR model originated from workers and their communities. It creates direct contractual relations between workers or the representatives and lead firms in a process of multi-party negotiation between lead firms, suppliers, and workers. Wait, let me mute you here, just a second. The model was developed following the success of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers Fair Food Program, the FFP, a campaign that significantly improved the working conditions of farm workers in the tomato fields of Immokalee, Florida. Now, the FFP has two key elements. One is a price premium, an additional penny per pound increase in the cost of tomatoes paid by the buyers, lead firms, and used to increase the wages of workers and fund the program's mechanism. The price premium, coupled with exclusive sourcing contracts between lead firms and suppliers who participate in the program, addresses suppliers' price squeeze and makes the program attractive to suppliers as well. The second element is a code of conduct for buyers and growers, informed and designed by workers. Additionally, the FFP emphasizes community building and worker-to-worker education and is based on an innovative and elaborate enforcement process with the capacity to exert sanctions in case of violations. Put together, these elements have led to changes in harvesting and farm practices that improved workers' lives and working conditions. Hence, the FFP is globally recognized as an effective program to address labor exploitation. So, Tamar, the next slide. WSR, like labor unions, in a sense, focus on workers' voice and agency. At the same time, they're like CSR. They rely on consumer and economic pressures to induce lead firms to adopt voluntary codes of conduct to avoid possible reputational risks. We argue that WSR's dual power resources in both workers on the one hand and consumers on the other is what structurally enables it to escape the supply chain logic that we saw in the AT, in the corporate anti-trafficking legislation, and as a result to transform corporate practices and workers' working conditions. Yet the FFP success, and the FFP is the WSR's most celebrated case, proved challenging to replicate. So arguably, this is due to the reliance of FFP on the unique features of the fresh tomato supply chain. Concretely, the US fresh tomato market is a concentrated market with a small number of powerful buyers who are reputation sensitive. Florida is the US's major producer of tomatoes, making it key to restaurants and supermarket supply chains. The tomato supply chain is short, making domestic making it easier to pass the wage premium down the chain in that it's domestic. It makes it easier to monitor and govern the supply chain. And also many workers are geographically concentrated in Immokalee, Florida, hence it can create a strong grassroots mobilization. And finally, tomatoes are a relatively cheap commodity that's consumed regularly, and therefore it's easier to get buyers and consumers to pay the premium price. The same features that enable the FFP to thrive, however, also make it very difficult to replicate. So in some ways, WSR is almost kind of a mirror image of a corporate anti-trafficking legislation, of CAT legislation. Now, this table highlights several axes of comparison. While they differ in their source of authority, private and public, and as a result in their voluntariness, both seek to expand lead firms' responsibility to the working conditions down supply chains. Now, perhaps the most important difference is the role of workers, right? While workers drive the process in WSR, they're almost invisible to the corporate anti-trafficking regulatory apparatus. Additionally, they differ in their compliance mechanism. WSR's effective compliance mechanism is backed up by market consequences, whereas CAT's soft law lacks both enforcement and market consequences from what we see, and any sanctions. Furthermore, WSR creates a clear set of labor rights obligations that are informed and designed by workers' needs. It introduced a price premium and a mechanism of exclusive sourcing to address suppliers' needs. Now, this is unlike corporate anti-trafficking that requires corporations to merely publish an annual statement with minimal requirements and does not address at all impact on suppliers. So our analysis shows the comparison between corporate anti-trafficking legislation and WSR models casts doubt on the adequacy and explanatory force of the distinction between soft and hard law in the anti-trafficking field. Because here, both corporate anti-trafficking and WSR rely on a market mechanism, and it's the voluntary worker-led initiative that is actually more robust in its demands and in its enforcement. The analysis of AT chains that were triggered by corporate anti-trafficking legislation suggests that the fact that they have no proven impact on exploitative labor practices is arguably due to the operation of anti-trafficking efforts as suppliers rather than stakeholders with capacity to exert pressure on lead firms. Now, despite this criticism, we do believe, and this is continuing the conversation we had in this workshop today, we do believe that corporate anti-trafficking legislation made a significant step in shifting the gaze from criminal actors as the main perpetrators of human trafficking and criminal law and border control to corporate responsibility to severe forms of labor market exploitation. That is the structural market conditions under which that sustain, modern slavery. However, to counter these structural conditions and effectively address human trafficking, not just shift the gaze, the soft version of hard law introduced by the UK MSA would need to undergo fundamental transformation that will intensify the demands and liability of lead firms, as well as create broader supporting institutional environment. In contrast, the dual basis of power and authority inside and outside the chain in WSR constructs WSR initiatives as alternative anti-trafficking chains that manage to distort the dynamics of the supply chain rather than strengthen it. By relying on the active leadership and involvement of workers and coupling it with targeted consumer pressure, WSR anti-trafficking chains have the potential to operate as effective private supply chain labor governance mechanism. We therefore argue the Wsr model bestows anti-trafficking chains with the potential to transcend this pendulum-like movement that we described of GVC's labor governance, of moving between decentering and recentering the state. By finding these new power resources in private law, workers' organizations, solidarity networks, and coalitions with workers. Indeed, while corporate anti-trafficking legislation so far fails to challenge the structural dynamic that creates and sustains human trafficking in supply chains, it seems like the WSR model, when tailored carefully and in the right context, provides a more promising template for change. So by way of conclusion, our analysis calls for an exploration of anti-trafficking schemes that, by merging the advantages of the two models, taking some of the state and some of the market and some enforcement and some consumer power, may contribute to the development of effective governance mechanisms in GVCs. So thank you. And our commentator is going to be Ioannis. I think this continues in some ways his paper.
Thank you very much, Hila and Tamar. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to read the paper and comment on it. I really enjoyed reading it, and I think actually drawing attention to worker-driven social responsibility schemes is crucial. And one reason for this is actually what came up a little bit in the discussion before, the legitimacy deficits that might exist in other forms of private governance and global value chains, while worker-driven social responsibility seems to actually address precisely that by giving voice and an active role to workers in such supply chains. And second, because they do indeed, like as you say in the conclusion, talking about worker-driven social responsibility in supply chains does open, I think, an avenue for institutional imagination and thinking about new possibilities in guaranteeing labor rights in supply chains. So I have 3 points, let's say, of broadly, which won't surprise you because I sent them a bit last minute, but still. So there's 3 points that of, let's say, critical inquiry, more as to the extent to which the text could go further, or whether you wanted to. So it's not really exactly a critique, more about an invitation to think, to reflect beyond. So the first point is about the role of law in generating anti-trafficking dynamics, and starting specifically with the creation of the corporate anti-trafficking category. So as I pointed out in my comments, I thought that the category of corporate anti-trafficking legislation, or CAT for short, actually really very much reflects current transparency legislation, but I'm not quite sure it corresponds exactly to the growing relevance of human rights due diligence legislation, which in fact entails, at least in the French example, sanction-based mechanism of enforcement, and it could in theory facilitate civil liability for lead firms for human rights violations in supply chains. So then following this equivalence between, let's say, transparency legislation and human rights due diligence legislation, all subsumed under the category of CAT, the example that you discuss is actually an example from transparency legislation, the Modern Slavery Act, and the conclusion is that the anti-trafficking chains that are triggered by CAT legislation are ineffective because the operation of anti-trafficking efforts is in the form of suppliers of human trafficking solutions and services. So my question is, and I think the paper actually goes at some points in that direction, to what extent we could see the particular anti-trafficking efforts as generated by the particularities of the legal instrument at hand. So in that case, not corporate anti-trafficking legislation in general, but specifically the transparency legislation of the Modern Slavery Act. So we would see the persistence of the Modern Slavery Act on transparency and market-led accountability as the reason for generating the current dynamics of anti-trafficking chains that we witness. So if we see that the law is responsible, if we were to assume that the law is responsible for generating ineffective anti-trafficking dynamics, would a different legal instrument not generate also different anti-trafficking dynamics? So that different legal instrument could be either human rights due diligence or potentially new forms of top-down regulation. So I think eventually the answer depends on what we see as really the reason for the form and effectiveness of current anti-trafficking efforts. So current anti-trafficking efforts, are they the result of the particular legal instruments that sort of instigate them? In that sense, the current ineffective anti-trafficking chains flow from this market-oriented transparency legislation? Or would we say that, the ineffectiveness of anti-trafficking anti-trafficking chains has to do with, the structural dynamics of supply chain governance and the power asymmetries therein that the law cannot meaningfully alter? So I think taking a position on this sort of theory of power would clarify a little bit the position as to what is really the source of this inability of anti-trafficking chains to meaningfully address modern slavery. The second comment is about this statement by the Fair Food Program, the leaders of the model, who stress the independence of politics, of independence of their model from state and politics. And I think this is a very interesting perspective, and I think there is a lot to unpack there. And I was thinking that perhaps it could enrich the paper to discuss it a bit further and discuss also its ramifications. So I think it would be, for example, particularly interesting to reflect on the emergence of this labor struggle paradigm in which the addressees of the workers' claims are solely private actors, so in particular lead firms. So essentially, this is a comment point on the role of the state in the paper, and whether the state is so going back to the discussion about the source of current anti-trafficking dynamics, anti-trafficking chains. The question would be, I think, whether we would see that there is a structural reason why the state is unable to interfere in supply chain relations, which therefore then makes lead firms more suitable to address worker struggle, so to become the addressees of such claims, or whether this inability of the state is actually just a contingent result of current politics. And I think eventually the answer comes back to just the question asked before. It's what theory of power, let's say, one subscribes to, whether the private power of corporate actors is a result of public power in the first place, or whether we could say that private power of private actors lies also beyond the sphere of politics. Then, given the shortcomings of existing worker-driven social responsibility schemes that you also highlight, among which also the ones that I think are more glaring are the ones that have to do with transnational relations and building transnational alliances and so on, how should we think, in your opinion, the relationship between such initiatives to state and top-down national and international regulations? So what are really the lessons that we could draw when it comes to the institutional imagination that I refer to from the Wsr schemes with regards to how they can be replicated and how they can be institutionalized further? And then finally, a brief comment about if you could just maybe briefly expand on the normative horizon of such worker-driven social responsibility schemes. So would you say that there is a potential in such schemes to fundamentally disrupt power dynamics in global value chains, or is it a model that essentially enhances the social sustainability of global value chains? For example, from a practical perspective, does worker-driven social responsibility increase the relative wealth of the relative, let's say, share of the wealth that the workers get in comparison to the retail price? Or does it increase in absolute terms through the premium price, the value that they get, but at the same time, lead firms are able to sell such products at a higher price because they market them as, sustainable and so on. And as such, the proportion the workers get actually decreases. This is exactly what Stefano Ponte described as the sustainability squeeze, so that in fact, sustainability initiatives may result in a higher higher wealth to producers in absolute terms, but not in relative terms. So just a comment on what the aspirations are with regards to wealth inequality and power dynamics of worker-driven social responsibility in global value chains. Well, these are my comments. Again, thank you very much for the paper, and I think it's a really great discussion.
Thank you so much for these wonderful comments. Let's open it up. We have couple more minutes, so we'll love to get more comments, and I see that Manoj is raising his hand, which is great because he is one of the experts on this, so it'll be great to hear from you. And thank you for joining us.
Hi everyone. Yeah, thank you for having me. I feel like a little bit of an interloper commenting just because I wasn't a part of the discussion in Delhi, and I haven't had a chance to read, I haven't had the benefit of reading this paper. But from the presentation, I think it's shaping up to be a really stimulating one. And I really appreciated Ioannis's comments as well, because I share some of the concerns that he's raised there. I guess what I wanted to probe just a little bit is this, the use of the worker-driven social responsibility as a conceptual category, because it seems to me that it operates more at a rhetorical level than as something that actually has any sense of kind of conceptual coherence. because it seems that the paper drew on the Fair Food Program, but of course the Fair Food Program is just simply one amongst many similar initiatives, both at the domestic level and at the international level. And between them, there are significant differences in terms of the parties that have initiated the program, their structure and how they operate, and even their longevity, I think. So I wonder, just sort of utilizing that term and then equating it with potentially the most successful of those initiatives that operated within a very specific kind of domestic environment, what we lose by doing that. But so I'd just be sort of interested in an answer to that question.
Thank you. Klaas?
Yeah, thanks. I think the idea of AT chains and this becoming services ultimately is really original and a real big contribution to the literature. I was wondering if it can't even be pushed further to the extent that we see with so the AT service providers, something that we can even generalize for any actor that plays a role in the regulation of GVCs. You were portraying GVCs now as this contested terrain of multiple regulators, civil society, state, and all these AT actors. And it seems that also the state itself has, let's say, can have second thoughts, can have interests of itself. So when we think about the politics of the Modern Slavery Act, of course, there's also something about portraying the regulator as being active. There's shaping global economy. In the case of the European due diligence regulation, there's a lot of also European protectionism involved. So in a way, each of the regulators that is involved seems to have a secondary logic to which they adhere, be it political, be it economic, etc. If this is true, then we maybe need to question this idea of a pendulum. It seems then it's much more a general evolution of a regulatory field rather than this shift between decentering and recentering the states. I was wondering, with the AT chains as a conceptual idea, you don't, in a way, underrun the very hypothesis that lies behind this pendulum idea between really two clear-cut phases of the regulation in the field.
Thank you. So Bimal, last comment.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks, Tamar and Hila. I'm just wondering, this is the same paper, and I know you have referred to that Asbad and Hita of 2017. I'm wondering, and that was also based on the same case. So how are you differentiating? Are you extending that paper argument, or how are you, developing this model? And
I didn't hear which paper you're referring to. Can you say that again?
Asbad and Hitov.
Oh, Asbad and Hitov, yeah. Thank you. Tamar, do you want to start? We really have only like 3 minutes. So, and you're on mute. So take 2 minutes and I'll take 1.
Sorry, I was muted and I didn't hear that I said that I'd rather you start.
Okay, so I'll start. These are really rich comments. Thank you so much, Ioannis, for this deep engagement with the text. And I think everything you said is point on and should definitely make us rethink some of the elements here. And thank you, all of you, for your comments. So I think, just for the lack of time, I'm just going to quickly try to address some of them together. I think you're right about corporate anti-trafficking legislation. Actually, we're thinking about transparency legislation, and I think we didn't do the work to see whether it fits due diligence or not. So this is a question whether in the paper we should just be talking about transparency legislation. I think we need to do more work to understand whether due diligence fits this as well. My sense was that despite the fact that the due diligence legislation has a sanction mechanism for human rights violations, it's actually so far not operational at all. And in some sense, it's maybe it will be effective, but it's so far not effective. And so in some ways it's very similar in the dynamics that it creates within the corporation. It doesn't, because it didn't yet create more exposure. So this is something I'd love to talk to you more about, but it's still something we need to explore. I think in terms of the big question that you're presenting about the power dynamics, and this is something that WSR are very keen about. I mean, they keep saying, you know, we are a private mechanism. We do not need the state. We want to use other power sources. And so I don't think that really lies beyond the sphere of politics, right? But I think when they say that, they're talking about labor politics and the way labor politics can be resisted within specific national context, especially in Florida, for example, while using other language, the language of human rights, the language of anti-trafficking, creates this other kind of politics, because it's not outside politics. But I think when we discuss that and the way they are independent of a specific legal jurisdiction, whether national or transnational, that's what it helps them transcend. And I think here the role of human rights and labor, and rather than labor rights, actually has a lot of purchase. So we really kind of have to finish. And Manoj, I do want to say that WSR is when we use the WSR model, we're thinking about the model that they propagate in the WSR network website, which is they are trying to suggest a model. It's very much stylized, and you're right. The critique of the WSR model that is much more stressed in the article than in the presentation today is that it's so difficult to replicate, that FFP is really the only success, that the Bangladesh Accord basically collapsed for some of the reasons. I think you can actually analyze using our power resources and AT chains analysis. I think it didn't really have labor power in the same way that they wanted it to have, and it was much more top down than bottom up. And this, we go into that a little bit more in the paper, and we just didn't have time for it today. But I think you're right that we should, and I think in the paper we are trying to be more careful about that. I think WSR is a conceptual category in the sense, and an FFP is one example, but it does have these moving parts, which are worker-driven, lead firm funded in some way through the penny per pound, and the idea of engaging suppliers through exclusive contracts. I think some of these elements are there in what they propose to be a model, and that we can see replicated in the Vermont example as well. I don't have time to go into class to what he said. I would love to continue talking with you about this. I think it's a really valid point. And Bimal Asbid and Chitov do something totally different. For it's basically their article is a love song to the FFP, which we chime into every now and again. But I think we also depart from it, both in contrasting it to the anti-trafficking chains in corporate anti-trafficking legislation, and by also highlighting the limits, the very significant limits of WSR in its difficulty to be replicated. And we also try to in our final part, we actually say, well, maybe we do need the state more than we think, because WSR can be only as strong as its consumer coalition. And in some products and some value chains, it's difficult to create such a concentrated, targeted consumer coalition. So Tamar, to you.
I will just add 2 points. To class, I agree with you. I think that maybe we're not stressing it enough in the paper, that our conceptualization is actually kind of a critique on the understanding of the GVC's government as a recentering and decentering, trying to depict it as more dynamic, as more dependent on power relations. And so it's true that maybe we sometimes uses it more like a description rather than analytical concept, but you are absolutely right. And actually it's similar to my reply to Manoj. I think what we use WSR as an open category, not and and the FFP is an example, but maybe we need to just call it differently, because we're not, because basically in the literature, there is a celebration of the notion of initiatives that are workers driven. So this is the idea basically. And we're trying to, as we do with transparency legislation, we try to analyze it by looking at a concrete case.
So thank you all very much for these very, very helpful comments, and especially to Ioannis for this engagement. And we are late, but we are moving. So I feel like tomorrow you have to speak. There's no other way. So thank you for joining
everyone.
us.
Okay. Bye, Deepaksha.
Bye,
Thank you,
Deepaksha.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank
Bye.
you.
See you tomorrow.